Good afternoon. I'm Morris Holbrook, and I'm sitting with John Howard, who is the George E. Warren Professor Emeritus of Business at Columbia University. And we're here today to talk a little bit about John's enormous contribution to the development of thought in marketing in general and in the area of buyer behavior and consumer research in particular. We want to look at some of the ways that he worked and developed theory in those two areas. John, let's go back to the beginning of things. Back when you were a child, I'd like to develop a little bit of some of the feeling for how you got interested in learning and some of the things that interested you when you were growing up. You're from the Midwest?
Yes, from Illinois.
Mm-hmm. You grew up out there in the rural area?
The rural area on the border to Indiana and Illinois,
mm-hmm.
and not the prairies, but Westville and Georgetown.
Okay.
Illinois.
And this was a farming community, was
A
it?
farming community, yes,
Uh-huh.
that's right. I grew up on the farm.
Your family had a farm, and you had a large family? You had some brothers and sisters?
Just one sister.
A sister.
Yeah.
And as you were growing up, were you active in working on the farm?
Oh, yes. Yes, I participated as everyone in the family did, and milked the cows and fed the horses and harnessed the horses and worked in the field.
Mm-hmm. I picture you getting up every morning at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. and getting out there.
Yes, that was a thing to do. You never thought anything about it being difficult because everybody did it.
Mm-hmm. You must then have gone through a period in high school when the Depression caught up with the farm.
Yes, that was a very serious period. Farms were being bankrupted right and left, and it was a terribly uncertain period. It was a difficult period.
So the economic realities were very much, I would think, part of your conscience.
Ever present, yes, no question about that. Yes, and it gave one, I think, an appreciation for the economic environment and how companies were needed to provide jobs and also to provide products
mm-hmm.
for people.
So was this really some of the first inklings that you had that this was an important area to be interested in?
Yes, and particularly stimulating was I happened to encounter some literature, some books on the industrial leaders like the Harrimans, the Hills, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, mm-hmm. and these really stimulated my interest. How these people were able to, of course they amassed great fortunes, but the key point to me was how they were able to build these big enterprises mm-hmm. and operate mm-hmm. Without training. They had just to learn as they did them.
Mm-hmm. So would it be accurate to think of you as a lad of maybe 15 or 16 out there on the farm going through this difficult economic situation and sort of dreaming about capitalism and big industry back in the East and that sort of thing?
Yes, and the railroads particularly were important because I knew the railroads, mm-hmm. familiar with them, and the Harriman and Hills were railroad people, mm-hmm. And how vital this was mm-hmm. to us, and yes.
And you were in Chicago is of course a great railroad community. Are you what, a couple of hours away from Chicago?
About 4 hours away.
4 hours away.
Mm-hmm.
But was there a general railroad ethic going on?
Oh yes, just a mile away. It was a railroad. Uh-huh. It went right north and south, and it was a favorite place to go and play. Would walk on the railroad. Uh-huh. And see the trains go by and so forth.
So you'd hear it whistling in the distance and you'd run down and watch the train?
That's right, yes.
past.
Very much so.
One of the favorite recreations.
Yes.
What else did you do for recreation in those days when you were a child?
That is an awfully good question. The church was the community center, and that's where so much of our recreation occurred, was the local church. And we had choir and this sort of thing.
Did you pick up a strong religious sense that then carried on into later life?
Yes, yes. That was very much so. It was a guiding source, and when there were problems and so forth, it was very important.
Okay, so it's been a source of strength.
Yes, a source of strength.
Okay.
Yes, well put.
Okay. Now back to the growing up in Illinois. I'm interested in your schooling. Did you go to school in the community there?
Yes, in one room school, country school, where all grades were taught together, and how the teacher made sense of them, I don't know how he maintained order, but it was a refreshing environment in which to go to school, because there was a deep respect for learning, and for one who did well in school, and so it was quite satisfying.
When you were in school, what sorts of subjects did you find interesting? I'm talking now about maybe first grade, second grade, early on.
All of them. I didn't have a particular interest at that time. By the time I got into high school, those interests had begun to form. I had a history teacher who was also the coach, Dick Sweeney, and physics I liked. I took agriculture courses, and I liked that. Mechanical courses. I was good at mechanical things, repairing cars and so forth. And things like plugging a coil onto the metal doorknob and calling the teacher in, and when he picked a hold of the doorknob, he was so shocked he couldn't let go. So we were involved in all kinds of mechanical gadgets.
That was one of your science projects?
That's right.
So there was a humorous, good-natured, fun-loving streak in some of your scientific work.
Yes, yes. Well played.
In those days. Okay. What did the teacher say when was it a he or a she?
A he. He was always one of my great supporters. He didn't seem to be angry particularly. He didn't think it was a wise thing to do, because it was 6,000 volt, but not much amperage, unfortunately. But we could have.
You could have hurt him.
Yes, could have hurt
him. Did he give you an A in your science project?
I think he did.
John, when you were in high school, did you have some teachers that were particularly strong and interesting that you were attracted to?
Yes. Ike Birch taught a physics course. It was very exciting. It was my first approach to any kind of a structure, a theory, and I found that exciting. Also in history, further in French, and in English courses. I enjoyed those. I never became a particularly good writer, but I enjoyed the English literature very, very much.
Okay, so you were in no way held back by growing up in a fairly rural environment. You clearly had an excellent local high school.
Yes, I felt no handicap. Now, when I went to college, I went first to a small 2-year college, Blackburn College, and I found no handicap there at all. Now, as Later, I went, that is, in Illinois, I found no particular handicap. When I went to Harvard for a PhD, I did find some handicap. But that was quite a different order of work, of course. Then I was out of school 2 years. After I finished high school, it never occurred to me to go on to college. That was the last thing I had thought of, was going to college. And a local minister thought it was, do you ever think about going to college? And I worked and sold insurance and was beginning to build up a practice in the insurance area at that age. And then I decided, oh, maybe I would go to Blackburn. I had heard about it. It had a self-help program where every student worked. And so I went there and finished 2 years.
So here you were in the middle of the Depression, fresh out of high school selling insurance. That must have been a tough sell.
It was a tough sell, yes. I tried various kinds of insurance, and I met some of the finest people. I remember in Danville was a local insurance man, and I was selling Farm Bureau insurance. And he said, look, you can do better than that. And so he advised me to try a regular company, Northwestern Mutual. So I went Northwestern Mutual. And he was always helpful, so that I got great help from, even at that age, from other people. This is one thing that's been true throughout my life, is I have gotten help from many, many people.
And given help to many others.
Well, I hope so. I should have, anyway.
Okay, so did that spark a fascination with marketing?
Probably did. I found it very difficult, of course, to stop in some farmer's home and say, I'd like to sell you insurance. I found that very difficult at the beginning. But I made a lot of friends. Yes, I think that it was clear I had an interest in business. There was no doubt about that. Marketing became much more sharply defined at Illinois, at the University of Illinois. I happened to encounter a particularly good teacher at the University of Illinois, Robert B. Mitchell, who was an astoundingly good teacher. And he really built my interest.
Did you go to the University of Illinois so that you could work with Mitchell? Did you? No. It was University of Illinois was a natural place to go for your last 2 years. It was a good school and well financed school and so forth. So it was a natural to go to Illinois and finish the bachelor's degree. And then while there, the dean, who became sort of a foster father to me, suggested I do graduate work, so I finished an MS at Illinois. Okay.
And then went out into business.
Were you the first Howard to get to college? You mentioned that you'd never thought about going to college.
I suspect that's pretty much true, yes.
Was your family all, excited and happy, or did they say, oh, don't do that, help us on the farm? How did they react?
They were supportive. They didn't understand me very well, but they were very, very supportive, as they were throughout life.
Okay. Yeah. But you didn't grow up with pressure that you should be the son who went to college. That was not a factor.
No. It was a great advantage I had, was that lack of pressure. It was, you did it because you wanted to do it. It was sort of a natural thing for you to do. You felt. I'd heard about Blackburn College, so we were going down with a friend to visit Purina Mills at St. Louis. So we stopped in to see Blackburn and talked to the president, and so I went to Blackburn. It was a Presbyterian school, and enjoyed it very much. I became assistant work manager, which was a job where in the second year, while you supervised a lot of students working, and that was a nice experience.
learning for you was something that you did because you enjoyed it, because it was interesting, and not because you wanted a better job or because your family was pressuring you to go on.
Very much that is well put. I simply, it's something I enjoyed doing and wanted to do, and never thought about the job aspect. It wasn't, I didn't worry about a job until I was about to finish Illinois, and I did a little interviewing, and then I went on to finish a master's degree instead. And then, when I finished a master's degree, the dean had a job for me as assistant director of the Chamber of Commerce at Lafayette, Indiana, which is the home of Purdue, as you know.
That's a good dean to do all that.
Oh, he was great. It was a fine experience at Illinois.
Were you in the business program?
In a business school, yes. I went to business school, yes.
Okay. And I know that's a big program they have now. Was it equally large then?
Yes. Relatively, yes, it was. And we had good teachers, and I enjoyed it. Also, of course, I took liberal arts courses along with it. I remember a poet. I had an awfully good class on poetry. And also I had public speaking courses and so forth, because I used to stutter. I used to block.
You used to stutter? Really?
And she carefully taught me to overcome that problem.
Well, that's remarkable. That's a hard thing to overcome, isn't it?
Yes, it was. And she was very good. She was one of the country's best. And I was advised to see her. And that was the thing that helped me in a way, because she said, look, you always must talk to your instructor at the very beginning and tell him or her, mostly hims then, that you have this problem, and so would they put you on the front row, or at least understand that when you hesitated, why you understood. And I got to know my instructors much better as a consequence of that, and that helped.
Worked to your advantage, actually.
Worked to my advantage, yes.
Okay, so you mentioned this guy Mitchell. Was he a marketing professor?
Yes, he was a marketing professor, yes.
He was at Illinois.
He was at Illinois.
And was your first exposure to marketing?
Yes, oh yes, I don't think I'd heard of the subject. Marketing, Illinois was strong in marketing. They had a number of good people there. So that helped.
And he made it very interesting?
Made it live, yes. I saw the relevance of it. He showed that how it could help you do a better job in terms of running companies. So that, yes, it was a very fun experience to have him.
What kind of approach were they taking toward marketing in those days? Was it the institutional approach?
Institutional, that is primarily the channels of distribution. Although there was one man there, Paul Converse, who was head of the department, who made a name for himself in building trade areas. Here is a little town of Lincoln, Illinois, what's the trade area? Where is the breaking point where people decided to go to Lincoln instead of a town in the other direction, you say, to shop?
Okay.
And he had used some regression and correlation analysis, particularly correlation, in shaping these out. He would do a survey, take the students out and do a survey. And then we would take the data and analyze it.
So you were involved in that data analysis?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I worked with him quite a lot on that. And that was a fine experience.
How long did you stay in the Chamber of Commerce at Urbana?
I was there a year, and World War II came along. And so I enlisted in the military.
Which branch?
Ordnance. Because I was told that that had some interesting jobs, and I would learn a lot in the Ordnance Code.
So you were viewing this as another educational opportunity?
That's right, yes. And so I was sent down to Aberdeen, Maryland, which was the Ordnance Training Center.
And how did you react to the military experience? I mean, did you feel terribly confined and hemmed in, or did you really find it an educational opportunity?
At first, the strict rules and the priority, the hierarchy, you know, the officer versus the enlisted man, I found a little difficult at first, but that didn't last long. And I found awfully, in where I happened to be working in classification, there was a PhD in history, pretty highly educated people, a lot of master's degrees and so forth. So, well, there were 2 PhDs in the group, one from Harvard in history, economics, I'm sorry. And so that it was a very a very friendly group, and we had a lot in common. So, and we spent our weekends going places together, you see, so forth. So it was, and they had different experiences, so I was able to learn enormously from them. And it was also, you were learning how an enormously big organization operates, how they got their people, how they fitted them in, the idea of a table of organization, how you had a table of organization which listed the various skills in an organization, so that you could in very short order build a division, so that how we were able to arm so quickly came out loud and clear from that experience. So that was a marvelous learning experience. And then once you were actually in active duty, that is, I was in Guadalcanal, there you saw how organization works and how the relationship between the Navy and the Army operated, you see, and so forth. So again, it was all a learning experience. It was just marvelous how, in a matter of days, when you moved into a new island, and there was nothing there, been shot to pieces, and in a short time there would be highways running down that island with tar roads that you could run 40, 50 miles an hour on. The ability to do that was a real shocker, to me anyway. I really saw what large organizations can do.
It sounds almost as if this military experience, rather than being drudgery or terrifying, was actually kind of exciting.
Oh, it was thoroughly exciting. I learned as much of that as I learned from college.
What happens next?
One thing happened in the interim there. The dean, my old dean at Illinois, wrote the professor of public utilities at Harvard, named Ruggles, who was an old friend of the dean's, and about me. And I happened to be stationed at that time out on Cape Cod. So the dean told me what he had done. And I called Ruggles, and he said, won't you come in and have dinner with my wife and myself? And so I went in to Cambridge and had dinner with him at the faculty club. And he encouraged me very much to do a PhD. And of course, I'd begun to think seriously about that at that time. In fact, for 4 or 5 years, I'd been thinking about it. And he said, but I would advise you to go across the river and get a good degree, meaning over at the economics department. And of course, that was not surprising comment, because he was trained as an economist, but also business schools then did not have much intellectual content at that time. And so they admitted me, and so I went to Harvard. And I found that very exciting. the idea of companies again, but from an antitrust viewpoint. But the economics generally I found exciting. A little rigorous, and it took a lot of work, but exciting. I learned in my second year there about Britain didn't have a monopoly policy. They had no antitrust, but they were debating that issue. And this was a real shock to me, that a God-fearing country like Great Britain didn't have an antitrust bill. So I thought, well, wait a minute. This would be interesting. So I went off and took the summer at Oxford and listened to Parliament debate the new bill. And that was a very rewarding experience, because here was a country that really had no need for antitrust because its markets were relatively open, and competition kept out to a considerable extent. Now, admittedly, there were cartels right and left, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it would have been had it not been kind of an open country where you could a lot of foreign trade operating.
So because of the interest in the effects of monopolistic practices, you actually went to Oxford and sat there and really watched Parliament debate an anti-monopolistic piece of legislation.
Yes, and in my mind began to write my dissertation.
Which was it in that area?
British monopoly policy. Yes.
Now, does this mean then that Harvard has won you over? I mean, you're now writing a dissertation about anti-monopolistic legislation, having first been concerned because you felt monopoly power was being attacked. Now you're over there in Oxford working on a dissertation which in effect is describing the emergence of anti-monopolistic legislation. Does this mean that you've been persuaded and won over?
To a substantial extent, I think, yes. Yes. Given I had the broader point of view that Schumpeter had given me, you see, which is the innovation, role of innovation, which softens very much your concern about antitrust.
Then what happened? You went on the job market? Did you go to the AMA to interview for?
Well, I went to the AMA to the Economic Association, and I'd offers small schools, and Converse wanted me to come back to Illinois at a much fancier salary than the others were paying, and I liked that, so I went back to Illinois.
He was your former teacher?
Former teacher.
And he remembered you and said, come back.
Yes. And that was a nice experience because there was some, John Dew in economics was there, and he and I worked together well, and he went over my papers that I was beginning to write and was a good critic and so forth. So that was a good experience.
Now, how did you decide to go back to a business school as opposed to trying to get a job in an economics department?
Because I was not clear that I wanted to teach straight economics. At that point, I didn't think I did. I wanted something closer to business.
Okay, so it's too theoretical.
Yeah.
The pure economics. You wanted something applied, and you flirted with the idea of going into industry.
Yeah, I had thought something about that.
What discouraged you from being a practitioner?
When I really thought hard, I said, wait a minute, I like the intellectual stimulus, but that's paramount. And I won't be happy unless I can be doing something related to that.
But when you first started, you stayed at Illinois for 2 years,
yes.
Right? Were you spending most of your time writing, teaching, trying to get a paper out of your dissertation? What were you actually doing?
Teaching and trying to get a paper out of my dissertation, and thinking about other things I might write. But it was mainly get the article out of the dissertation.
That was you mentioned the journal Political Economy, was that
Yeah.
the one? So it took a couple of years really to get the research flow started.
Yes,
because
yes.
This was the first order of business. Was there a lot of pressure?
No, there was not a lot of pressure. No, it was self-generated pressure. I wanted to get it done, because somehow it seemed to me that was the right thing to do. One ought to do that.
One ought to,
Yeah.
but the school didn't expect
No,
it.
no.
Were the standards very different in those days as far as the number or the amount of publication that they
Not as much emphasis on publication as there is today. There was substantial. If I should have, by their standards, should have done it all right, but the pressure was not quite so strong. Substantially less strong. But ultimately, it was supposed to be done at Illinois, no question.
And it was the same system we have today? You have 7 years, and
Yes.
then they evaluate you for tenure? And now we've gotten you up to about 1950, I think, right?
Yes, that's right. 1950, I went to Chicago.
And how did you jump from, I assume you would see it as a jump up from Illinois to the University of Chicago?
I didn't think of it as being such a great jump. You know, I didn't appreciate where Chicago stood in the hierarchy. That is, I didn't really understand that. And so it was different, but it didn't seem so different.
Well, how'd you get the opportunity? They just came looking for you out there in the...
I went to a meeting at Northwestern, a marketing meeting, and I sounded off on some issues. One of the faculty, Northwestern faculty, I think it was making some comments, and I called them on it. And this pleased the people at Chicago. So they came over and said hello, and would I be interested in coming to Chicago? Yeah.
And so you got an invitation.
That's right.
To come to Chicago. Now, how about that place? That place I've heard is pretty high pressure environment.
Yes, it is. It's rigidity. It has a philosophy with the emphasis on economics and statistics. And not only that, but also that the way you go about doing things, you take a little piece and do it very thoroughly empirically. The idea of major theorizing is just out. Now, if you're a senior professor, you may get by with it. But a junior professor better not try it.
Okay, so you better be technical.
Yes.
Quantitative.
Yes.
Empirical.
Empirical.
Positivistic.
Positivistic, yes.
And were you all those things?
Within limits. Not. I thought there's also need for major theorizing. I thought there was need for that.
So even then, you were branching into broader theory.
Yes.
And
yes.
Were they happy to see you branching into broader theory?
No. They thought it was premature, I think. And that was never said. I don't know what the evaluations were, what was said at the evaluation. But I got no hint that was their thinking, but it may well have been, could well have been.
When you say that they thought that it was premature, do you mean premature for the field or premature for you?
Premature for me.
For you.
And the kind of thing that only a few senior professors did, that could do, like Frank Knight and Milton Friedman and so forth, you see.
But now these are economists, right?
Yes.
Friedman and those.
But
those
you
guys.
see, the School of Business judged itself in relation to economists strongly because there was that Chicago environment that a business school is not a very respectable place.
I want to get back to something that we were talking about earlier in terms of the influence of Hutchins and the whole liberal arts program. Can you describe how that what sort of impact that had on the School of Business?
Yes. I would talk that over sometimes with some of the faculty that I felt I knew well and could talk with. And that is, the University of Chicago Business School people were not at all proud of being on a business school faculty.
Because of the ethos. I mean,
Yeah.
Hutchins, correct me if I'm wrong, but Hutchins came in with the great books program, right? The liberal arts point of view, which I think he partly borrowed from Columbia and other schools. The idea that the well-educated person had read widely in the humanities and so on, right?
Yes.
And so there was a very much a sort of humanistic attitude that would essentially look down on business.
Yes. Yeah.
And you felt that.
Yes. And I felt, the faculty felt that. And therefore they were rather rigid in the way that they looked upon things being done. George Shultz, who's now Secretary of State, came to Chicago from MIT. And I got to know George well. We became friends. And he and I talked about this at length. And we came to an agreement that, look, you'd be better off to move to another school that doesn't expect, that will accept your eccentricities that Chicago didn't feel was appropriate. I was convinced, beginning to be convinced myself, and his was confirmation. And I had great faith. I liked George and trusted him. He had splendid judgment, I felt. So it was just, it sewed up the deal.
Okay. And then what did you have contacts elsewhere that you just began to?
Yeah, I began to note that I was interested in moving. I talked to people in Minnesota, and then this offer came from Pittsburgh, and that was very exciting.
Okay.
Because there was going to be a new great business school. Secondly, very close to Carnegie Mellon across Panther Hollow, and that was the most exciting institution I have ever seen. I have never seen an institution that intellectually bounced like that School of Management did. I'm talking about the School of Management. Lee Bach had been brought in as a dean, and he had proceeded to bring in Herb, and at the other extreme was Mel Anshin, and Dick Sire, Jim March, and others. It was a remarkable place. And it was beginning to show what could be done.
Were you in close contact with Simon and March and Sire and all those guys?
Yes, yes. I was over there a lot. And Herb and I were consultants with the Ford Foundation. Ford Foundation was spending $35 million to rebuild the intellectual foundations of business schools, matching the study done of medical schools some 10 years earlier or something like that, a real renovation.
So you were working with Simon, with Herb Simon?
Yes.
And did he change your thinking, or did you change each other's thinking?
Oh, he changed my thinking. He was unusual. He would talk to anybody who would talk. There was no great pride in the person. And he was just then beginning to think out of sociology and organization theory into information processing. He was just beginning to look at the computer in that light. That was a whole new day at that time.
This is really by way of more broadening of your exposure to the behavioral sciences. I mean, you're coming from economics. You run into people like Simon and Sire and March and these characters, and they're exposing you much more heavily to the social sciences.
And they were unique in the sense they would let anybody on their faculty do anything he wanted. They would say only, now sometime down the road you've got to come up with something. You're your own judge as to what you can do best. But down the road you've got to come up with something. But that was a freedom that a lot of schools wouldn't give them. They would try guiding them too early, you know, in the Chicago's. That was criticism I had of Chicago. They didn't give the freedom to develop. I was the marketing critic of the Ford Foundation consultancy arrangement.
I see.
I was the one who said, this is what's wrong with marketing the way it's being taught, and that was my role. And then it was about that time that the Ford Foundation asked me to do a study of the state of knowledge of marketing in American business schools.
Did you win that opportunity or get that opportunity by virtue of the dean at Pittsburgh bringing the Ford Foundation to you?
I think it was more that I had written a marketing book while at Chicago.
Which book was that?
That was the first marketing management book.
Marketing management.
Yeah.
First edition.
First edition,
Okay.
that's right. And I think Hal Levitt had something to do with it. They asked a number of people who was the best person to do this job.
Now that book, that marketing management book, was that unusual in any way?
Yeah, now that reflected very much the Chicago orientation, that first edition, because it was made heavy use of marginal analysis, the cost, and this kind of thing. Because while I was at Chicago, I was also working with the accountants a lot. They were beginning to move into marginal analysis. And with my economics background, I fitted into that. And I was giving lectures before controllers groups and so forth.
Now, what were the other people doing? You had broken away from what?
From the channels.
Okay.
Emphasis on channel, a sort of a channel orientation.
Okay. So the others were doing the sort of the institutional approach.
Yes.
Here's what a channel looks like, here's what a retail store looks like. Sort of descriptive.
That's right.
Commodities, those kinds of approaches.
Yes.
And you came in and were one of the first people, I gather from what you're saying, to say, look, we have to treat this as a decision-making problem.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Was that point of view welcomed with open arms by all your colleagues and everybody?
Many colleagues, but not by near all of them. It didn't take off. And I was not the best writer in the world. You had to articulate these things in a new way. But it was well received. It was admired more than used, I think.
People said, hey, that's pretty clever, but let's go back to studying channels?
I think there was a lot of that, as there always is in change, but it was particularly so, I think, there.
When you wrote the book, and you took it to I assume you wrote it and you took it to a publisher and said, hey, here's a book, a little different approach. It's completely different from what you've been used to. It doesn't have any descriptions of channels or commodities or whatever. It's about decision-making, the marginal analysis, etc. Did you have trouble getting it published? Or
No. Prentice Hall wanted it, and Irwin wanted it. Prentice Hall laid a $100 check on my desk one day and said, here. I went with Irwin because I had known them. And, so
it couldn't be bought?
No, couldn't be bought. Not by $100.
Not for $100. Okay. By this time, you're really being challenged because you've moved to Pittsburgh. You've got job security. You've got tenure. You've written the book. You're now combined. You're put together with Simon and Syatt and March and these first-class minds from the behavioral side, which really was an area that you hadn't had much exposure to. And I'm curious how you reacted.
I was enthused. I was very excited. My wife used to get on to me and say, whenever we go to a party, all you do is get off there and talk about business schools, and you don't entertain us. It was very, very fulfilling to be associated with that group. You felt that you were a part of something new and important. That was the wave of the future. And about that time, Tom English of Alcoa, who was in charge of transportation, said, look, I've got a little problem here. Can you help me on it? And this was, we make decisions about how to transport our products and our raw materials. We can send them either by water, by rail, or by truck. How can we study that? Of course, this was a natural in decision making. So that was number one. Number two, the Ford Foundation, in my earlier agreement with them, when I agreed to do the study, I said, I'll do this if it will give me $10,000 to do a pricing study when we get the book done, when we get the study done. They said, okay. $10,000 was peanuts to them, of course. And so they gave me that $10,000, and I went down to Gulf Oil, and the senior vice president said, okay, you go up to Toledo and see our man there, and he'll work with you. And I walked into his office, and I found out he made 1,000 pricing decisions a year to filling stations over 4 states. And I told him what I was there for, and he said, I don't know how I do it, and I don't think you can find out, but I'll be happy to cooperate. And that was done working again with Herb Simon on how to structure a decision process. Bill Morganroth one of the doctoral students, worked with me on that.
And did you model the freight choice the same way you modeled the price choice?
Not as thoroughly and as well as we did the case of the Gulf vice president, but yes, essentially the same. That again, you see, was Herb's major, one of Herb's major contributions, was to stimulate that kind of research.
This notion of boxes and arrows. I mean, you know, everyone thinks of the models and these boxes and arrows. Was that something that you picked up from Simon?
Yes. He said to me one day, you know that the computer has made a far greater contribution to science by the flowchart method than it has by its speed of computing.
Drawing pictures?
Yeah.
Where did this lead next?
The next step was a major grant to do a study of the state of knowledge as taught in marketing in American business schools, particularly graduate schools. And that implied a great opportunity because the Ford Foundation status and funds, reputation, and really the opportunity to take a hold of the field as a whole and do something hopefully beneficial. The Ford Foundation, as it worked, more and more came to believe, and I think correctly, that what was needed most of all was the behavioral sciences. Now, you could put in economics or leave it out, whichever you wish, but it was the non-economic behavioral sciences they were particularly interested in exploiting in business schools. They felt should be exploited in business schools.
And did you see yourself as at that point as an integrator, pulling all this together?
No, I hadn't. This was one of the problems I had, was that somebody expected me to do that, to pull together where there wasn't anything to pull together. Other words, I had come to conclude that economics had little to offer to where you wanted to bring in the buyer. Number one, that psychology had, so far as I knew, had little to offer, some maybe, and sociology, I didn't know anything much about that. Oh, about social class, yes, from Chicago, and also, but I didn't know about Paul Lazarsfeld's work, and that was key later, turned out to be. So I said, wait, I just can't do it.
You said you couldn't perform this role?
I couldn't perform this role after I really thought hard about it. And when I came to that conclusion, the cold sweat broke out, believe you me. I finally said to myself, those guys at Chicago that used to ridicule marketing are on better foundations than I realized they were.
Aha. Did you feel a sense of despair? Or?
Yes, great despair. I hated to do it because, gee, all the status and everything, the excitement that went with this, you see, that was going to be great fun. So I talked to Herb Simon and Emanuel Weiler, the dean at Purdue.
Weiler at Purdue and Simon at Carnegie.
Yes.
You confessed.
Yes.
What did they say?
And their statement was, try it. You'll be surprised what comes out of it.
They were reassuring.
So, very reassuring. And I said, if those guys are reassuring, I would be a fool not to give it a try. And once I jumped into it and began to talk to people, my excitement rose. Because it did, you did begin to see the opportunity that lay out there.
I'm trying to think back. This is about 1960, right?
Yes.
Roughly.
About 1960.
Okay. And I'm trying to just remember, I mean, think about what I know about what the state of knowledge in the field was like in those days. And it seems to me that the work on the consumer side of marketing and buyer behavior was mostly from the point of view of the guys who were doing the motivation research.
Yes, the Freudian
Yeah.
orientation. Yes.
How did you react to that?
It was shallow to me. It wasn't being really tested. I didn't feel comfortable with it. And they were making assertions about consumer behavior that I didn't believe.
Now, when you say it was shallow,
Yes.
I mean, after all, they talk about depth interviews. In what way was it shallow?
There was not an attempt to use positive methodology, positivism. There was not attempt to structure it and then to get data and test that structure. And rather loose in their interpretation.
Okay. You thought the theory was loose.
And what they drew out of their data was loose.
Okay. I'm wondering if you see that as a general indictment of the psychoanalytic approach or the interpretive approach, or if you just felt that it wasn't being applied very well in those days.
I was skeptical of the Freudian interpretation to a substantial extent. Some of the conclusions about what people did, why they did. Number one, and number two is it was also the methodology used. It was both of those. I'm glad you brought this up, however, because that was an important area of research, and I had not mentioned it.
So if we could characterize the point of view of these guys in motivation research, was that the consumer or the buyer was acting from a large number of essentially unconscious, repressed wants, and that therefore, from that perspective, buying behavior wasn't very rational. It was an irrational kind of activity, and this bothered you. Is
Yes.
that correct? You
Well
saw buying as a more rational process.
Yes, splendidly put.
Okay. Would you say that was due in part to the Simon Syatt March influence?
I suspect so. The economics and the Syatt March,
Okay.
the two together.
Okay. So you felt dissatisfied with the literature that was out there on the consumer, on the buyer, because of its roots in motivation research.
Yes.
And you felt we needed a more structured model.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, what did you do? Did you read books for 2 years? How did you proceed?
I talked to people largely in the various fields. And I didn't do a lot of going back to the basic sciences and reading. I was more inclined to take the connecting material, get my ideas from it, and then go check it with the respective authority in that area. So that I minimize my reading in a sense.
Now, in a way, that's a style, a way of doing research that may be more unique to you, may be something that you do better than other people, the notion of talking and learning and then talking to somebody else and bringing it together. Do you feel that's a strength?
Could well be. Yes, it could well be. My relations with Bill McGuire are exactly of that type. We'll get to those a little bit.
So it's a conversational mode of collecting information that reaches, it's really more efficient in some ways than going to the library.
Yeah, and particularly at that time, because there was not a lot of the interlinking material, and it took somebody in the field who really could say that is consistent with the field and that isn't. For me to know the field well enough, for me to feel comfortable that I knew the field, would have been a major job.
Now, the title of that book was Marketing, Executive and Buyer Behavior.
Yes.
And I'm trying to think, that must have been one of the first books to have buyer behavior linked in with marketing in that way.
So far as I know, it was. Yeah, so far as I know. I think I was giving a lot of talks around American Marketing Association meetings, and I think that's valid.
Now, did you get resistance? Did people say, oh, this isn't important, or you're wasting your time, John, with this stuff, or how'd they react?
There was substantial coolness among a significant part of the audience. You'd have some of the audience who would be quite enthusiastic. It would be smaller than the cool part.
Now, you've published the pricing study. We've got that finished. The forward study's been completed. We have one of the early fusions, in a sense, or syntheses of the managerial side with the consumer and the buyer behavior side being brought together in the executive and buyer behavior book. And things must have been looking pretty good at Pittsburgh right about then.
Yes, yes. And yet I moved.
And yet you moved.
Yeah. Because at that time, the chancellor began to be at odds with Richard King Mellon, who was giving the money largely for University of Pittsburgh. And it was clear that these problems were going to become greater. And it seemed that I'd be wiser to move, so I came to Columbia.
Did Columbia come to you and say,
yes,
we need help?
Yeah. Mel Anshin had been at Carnegie and was moving to Columbia because he wanted in a big city. He's a big city guy. And he told Courtney Brown about me. And Courtney called me up and asked me if I'd come.
So were you then able to bring in, to do a lot of recruiting?
Yes. Courtney supported thoroughly bringing in people. And he knew good people when he saw them. And he was just 100% supporter. So just loads of freedom to do a job on that. Farley and Lehman had quite an effect, particularly Farley. When I got the, Ford found, General Foods, when I went to Columbia and began to try to build a theory. When I left Pittsburgh and went to Columbia, I said, I'm going to build a theory of consumer behavior.
A theory of consumer behavior?
Yeah, or buyer behavior. And General Foods learned about it. I'd been talking to them about it, I guess. I told them. And they said, we're introducing a product out in Portland, Oregon, called Instant Breakfast. Would you like to run a special panel out there, and we'll give you the data. We'll collect the data for you. Of course, I jumped at the chance. And we did the study, and of course, it was a very fine thing to have to do, to articulate a study from that theory, because it forced you to see that theory much more sharply than otherwise you would have. That is, when you started operationalizing the questions. as you know so well.
Now, at this point, was the theory, had it been created? Theory.
It was getting along fairly well. Yeah.
Right.
And when that was finished, we got that data back. And I presented, John Farley said, I'm going to model that. And he and Winston Ring modeled it. Now that was a key step because that kind of thing had not been done before. The data had not been usually collected in the framework of a structure, typically, and much less modeled then. And so that was a major jump that John Farley contributed, and of course Lehman helped along the way too, enormously. Yeah.
Before that, going back to the development of the theory, how did you get the bright idea one day to sit down and work out a model of the consumer such as came out in the early 60s?
That's a good question. It was a natural follow-out of the flowchart kind of decision we'd done on executives and the two kinds of executives, and the kind of decision, the information processing material. It was sort of a natural flow out of that. Also in this, I had talked a lot with Ray Bauer at Harvard. And Ray was very much interested in consumer decision. And was the uncertainty, the confidence.
Perceived risk?
He was very much interested in that. So that would have been a big push toward that direction. And they just sort of fitted together, and it seemed the thing to do. And at the same time, also, I must say, I was working with Jagdish. He had finished his dissertation on attitude and done very good work of figuring out the work of Burt, the psychologist in England, on attitude. And with his work in attitude and the confidence and the other pieces, it began to pull together into a system. Yeah.
And so in '63, you were still at Pittsburgh. You were just leaving Pittsburgh.
That's right.
To come to Columbia. You were just coming out with the second edition of the marketing management book. The second edition of the marketing management book was the first publication of the first of these general consumer behavior models, right?
Yeah.
And in that book, then, is a chapter with a flow diagram, boxes, arrows, decision process for consumers. Now, can you think back, can you remember, I mean, you're sitting there on a Sunday afternoon and you've got the doodling on the page. I mean, when did it come to you? How did it?
This was the Herb's, the Carnegie environment that brought that on, because it was just such a natural thing to do.
And so that came out, that work was finished in '63. Now, this was a major, I mean, you had your marketing textbook, edition 1, edition 2. Edition 2, it differs from edition 1, I assume, primarily by virtue of including this rather innovative new way of looking at the buyer. Did you get support? Were people happy to see this?
That revision?
Well, did you get reinforcement? Did people resist the new way of looking at the consumer, or were they glad to?
It did not go over with a bang. It got used, particularly in the leading schools. Berkeley, Stanford, MIT, Chicago, and so forth. But it did not get widely used.
So it was given that it was used at the better schools, you had reason to feel that it was too advanced.
Yeah. I salved my wounds.
Yes. Okay.
That.
And all this time, you were maintaining very close ties to industry.
Yes.
Getting support. They were giving you data. They were giving you access to test markets, access to data, paying for a lot of research, and so on.
Yes.
Did you ever feel in any way compromised or pushed in directions you didn't feel comfortable with by virtue of working closely with industry?
No, not. There was not much of that. Sometimes it was a little, but I was rigid. And that's one reason I think I didn't get it accepted more. If I had been more flexible, I wouldn't have gotten my goals achieved as well, but I would probably have gotten it more accepted. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't give. Mm-hmm. And so it did raise some problems. By and large, not much.
Now that Howard Chef book was never revised. I mean, there was no volume 2. What happened there? How did that work out?
I didn't. Found later Jagdish wanted to revise it, but I didn't feel it was sort of revisable. Mm-hmm. That there was a major. We were ready for a major change, mm-hmm. and that's what's coming out in the current book. Mm-hmm. Is really major change from that 1969. The 1977 book was a major change, mm-hmm. and this is a major change from 77. Mm-hmm. So the changes that were just, it seemed to me, were so great that if you tried to modify the existing, you would lose something. I felt now that this kind of thing wasn't being, there were real problems getting acceptance of it in industry. Mm-hmm. And so it seemed to me there were 2 routes that needed to be taken. One is do a better job of getting MBAs to understand it and to do it. And that's what the current manuscript does. Mm-hmm. It gets them easily into the computer, the modeling, and the whole ball of wax, mm-hmm. so that they can end up with, here is a set of answers to a set of questions that management has. Mm-hmm. So that was number 1. Number 2, and simultaneously, parallel with this, were Farley and Lehman doing studies of those studies and some others, which led to, what was it we called it, their meta-analysis book, which just came out a few months ago. And that was a major contribution because it tested and verified a lot of generalizations that I would have never done, and that are perfectly applicable, because in order to do a key thing, in order to enable one 6-variable model to tie together a whole textbook, and also build a larger framework within which that 6-variable model would operate, a much more elaborate theoretical framework. And that's where Farley and Lehman, and there are people who worked with them, a great variety of them worked with them, were so very helpful, is of building, laying a foundation for building that bigger framework. And so that was another thing, and ended up in the meta-analysis book. Those 2 streams were running down the road together, trying it on a book which brings it all together, and here is a more general framework within which that smaller, modified version can operate.
The question that occurs to me is to ask whether there has been any major modification in the theory itself, or is it more a question of supporting and packaging the theory, both to give it some validation empirically and also some ability to communicate it to others?
There's been some major changes in content. A key one is, for example, the variable brand recognition. That never got very well defined, as you may remember. It was pretty sloppily defined in earlier versions. Now that is rather sharply defined and considerable evidence available for its role. And there's a lot of backup that we never had before on that particular variable. And its role in terms of also supporting other four variables in the system, you see, at the same time. So there is some, not a lot, but that one, there is substantial change.
This would be the variable, I think, that you tie into the work by people like Roche and so on category formation?
It would be a part of that, but so would attitude. You're right. That's another piece, and thank you. Another major piece that we've never had before, and that is what we call the product hierarchy. The Roche material and the shoe gun material that takes Roche into more consumer behavior orientation. And does two things. It shows how the customers is guided in terms of their search and attention and memory and so forth. But it also shows how competition fits in there simultaneously in that product hierarchy. Here is a car, here is a vehicle, truck, bus, and under cars, family, and so forth. I can see the restructuring of how we think as a result of trying to pull together and integrate the various elements that we teach in a business school. I'm very unable to say the details of that, because we haven't tried it yet, significantly, it seems to me. And you never know until you try it how the thing will look. When I was asked to do the Ford Foundation study, I had no idea how that thing would look. And it seemed to me that's it's analogous here. Now, we're far better structured today than was marketing at that time. Almost no structure. But that just says it's going to be harder to change, that's all.
So to pursue the analogy, you started out with the Ford incentive from the Ford Foundation to say, okay, let's integrate marketing. And 25 years later, you've more or less done that. Now you're saying, let's integrate business as a whole.
And with its environment, particularly the market.
And in this integrative approach, what role do you see marketing as playing, vis-a-vis, say, finance?
I think marketing, of course, part of it I have a vested interest in, not unbiased, should play a major role, a leadership role. I think we've thought about the integration of the marketing operation with the market far more than anybody else has. And there's a lot of analogs that will be encountered in this integrative attempt, like, or to, the marketing operation to the market. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So you see marketing as having a future?
Yes, I see it have a future.
Okay. What have we left out?
Nothing that I know of.
Have we covered? How do you feel now, looking back? You've been, let's see, you started in about 46 in the PhD program, about 1950 roughly, so it's been 37, 38 years. As a teacher and as an academician, it's been something closer to 40 years. Is it a good life? Is it something you're glad you did?
Yes, very much so. Remember sitting up at Arden House at a meeting. I was the only one from academia, and 3 others were from business. And they were saying, each of them, now, I wish I had done this. And they turned to me and said, what about you? And I was the only one who said, I wouldn't change it. That I thought the academic life gave me the greatest satisfaction that I would have had rather than in business, I think.
So this is, for you, this is the best of possible careers.
It seems to me. Now, I may be just narrow-minded, but yes, I think the answer to that is yes.
I'm sorry, Spiro, I can't hear you. You want me to thank him? Do you have a final statement you want to make? Okay. Are we rolling? Okay. John, we've been talking about a career that spans almost half a century, going back to right after the war, 40 years of dedication to teaching and research. And I'm just wondering, if, as you look back, do you find that this has been a satisfying kind of career?
Yes, it's been a very satisfying career. Very happy to have done it. I have found greater satisfaction, I think, than any other way.
And you've touched so many lives. I mean, I know in my own case, of course, that's true, but I'm thinking of so many students, so many colleagues, so many faculty, so many other researchers that have drawn on your support and your ideas and your wonderful creative mind and your ability to inspire others to do work along the same lines. What's brought you the most satisfaction?
The greatest satisfaction that I have gotten is from interaction with people like yourself. And talking together, putting ideas together, and ending up with a creative structure. It is very satisfying and almost a spiritual kind of a satisfaction.